We have another great set of speakers this week. And I have no housekeeping today, so I should do a big long intro and say a bunch of things typically, but I'll just thank the Brain and Mind Center as well as Tom Swanton for their help in pulling this week's seminar series together, and then pass the conversation over to Sally Gainsbury to introduce our guest this week.
Thank you very much, Khalil. So I'm Associate Professor Sally Gainsbury. I am the Director of the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, and it's my pleasure to be co-hosting the Technology, Risk and Gambling webinar series. And I do want to thank everyone who has been sending positive comments. When we are broadcasting out into the ether, it's really great to have any feedback we can get of how things are going. So thank you to all of those who are engaged live online and leaving your comments. And thank you for all the people who have sent emails or mentioned in passing that you're viewing and enjoying the series. That's really positive and helpful feedback for us. So please do send the feedback in. And similarly, if there are any topics you'd like to cover or speakers that you recommend for us, please let us know. So today we're picking up on the theme we've discussed across season 2, which is looking at how is technology being used to identify and respond to gambling risk and harms, being mindful of the multiple different stakeholders and perspectives, the operators or corporations that are potentially deploying risk detection AI technology, and of course the individuals, the customers who are the ones having their behavior tracked and monitored, and what is the appropriate response from a corporate social responsibility or a corporation point of view, and from the consumer point of view. So today I'm joined by 2 experts that bring different perspectives to this topic. So first of all, I have Dr. Sascha Callaghan, who is executive member of the Technology Addiction Team, which does present this series. And Sascha is a health and technology bioethicist and lawyer, and she's an expert communicator on these emerging and complex issues around the ethics and regulations of technology as they come across. And I'm also very pleased, particularly given the time difference, to be joined by Dr. Michael Auer, who is a statistician and psychologist and very well known for his work in risk detection. He has done a tremendous amount of research on this topic and really contributed to our understanding. And he has actually developed and leads an industry with a player tracking tool called Mentor that's currently used by over 30 different online gambling establishments around the world. So these 2 speakers are going to really bat back and forth the different topics and the wide-ranging questions we have. Again, we may have more questions and answers at the end of the session, but I'm hoping it will be, and I'm very sure it will be very thought-provoking and stimulating. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, thank again both of our speakers, but I'm going to ask Michael for you to start, given your extensive background in AI and player tracking, to give us a bit of an overview of what is the industry doing, what have we learned, and how is AI being used to understand and detect player risk?
Sure. Thank you, Sally. It's midnight here, so a little bit past midnight, but I'm still trying to focus and to activate. And thanks for inviting me for the series. I'm very happy to contribute out of my statistical and psychological capacity. So coming back to your question, I'd say in the mid 2000s, so by 2007, 2008, some companies, individuals, researchers started to think about gambling data and how they could actually be used to identify potentially problematic play and, of course, subsequently, interact with players. And the idea, of course, lies at hand because in online gambling, compared to typical land-based gambling, you know what each and every player is doing at each and every point in time. So you know how much to wager, how much they win, how much they deposit, how much they withdraw. And you do not only know the intensity of their play, but you know how they play. And that's an important aspect, maybe, also for Sascha to pick up them, because ultimately you could just, cut off, let's say, the 1% of most intense players, and toss them in a basket, and highlight them as the problematic players. But it's of course not as easy as that, because it also depends a lot, how much does a person actually have available income, and how much of that income do they actually spend for gambling. Back then, I'd say, technology-wise, of course, a lot has happened since then. And with, Google and Facebook, they basically developed a whole new set of technologies that make actually able what we do to this day. So we, me and my company, so we work with the Google Cloud, and basically are able to capture gambling behavior in real time and analyze it in real time, and also interact with the player in real time. And to me, this is an important aspect. It's not just about about a binary decision, whether, okay, is this a player who might show indications of problematic play and that player does not. Of course, you can never tell, basically make those black and white decisions, but it's a lot about what can I actually do about it, right? So do I have a delay? Do I have to wait until tomorrow? Do I have to wait until next week until I'm able to crunch those data? Or can I do something at the very moment I observe some sort of odd type of behavior? And I would say that that type of analytics, that type of intervention has only been possible maybe for 3 or 4 maximum up to 5 years. I mean, given a cost benefit a computation, because these days you can do it in a very less costly manner, whereas before this would have sort of cost you a fortune. And I think that's also important to keep in mind. What do you actually have to invest? What kind of technology do you need? And what's actually the benefit ultimately of an operator following that type of approach? And I would say to this day, a lot of operators and basically apply those types of techniques, more so because regulators more and more, I'm talking now especially about Europe, because here almost every country has some sort of online gambling regulation, and the UK, Spain, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, now Germany, they all require basically in the law, in the regulation, operators to profile player behavior, spot signs of problematic gambling, and also interact with players. And of course, those sort of requirements, they also boosted the technology, the approaches that operators are currently applying.
Thank you for that overview. I think it's really interesting where, especially there is a legislative requirement for companies to monitor and respond to risk, but there's no details about what is risk and what response is necessary and what to do if the player doesn't respond to an email or the appetite of the company. Sascha, what are your initial thoughts? I know that coming from sort of outside of the gambling field, you've rapidly done a bit of back learning on the topic. So what are some of the questions you've been thinking about?
Well, so my first observation is that in an emerging area, like whenever there's a sort of emerging tech and regulation is trying to kind of keep up with that, the first phase of any regulatory process is going to be a sort of like a data gathering phase, really. So it makes sense for the regulation not to specify, what problem gambling is, what precisely needs to be done, because no one really knows. No one has a good idea yet about what tools we have, how they're best deployed, and whether they work. So the first phase in good regulation is to try a few things and see how they go, and then evaluate them. So I guess what I would like to ask Michael, because obviously Europe is well ahead of where we are in Australia in terms of mandating these kinds of interactions, although they do happen here as well. So Michael, is there much data available yet about what tools are being used and which have been the most successful? What do we know about tools that have been successful so far? And could you tell us a bit about them?
Yeah, sure. So here, I mean, I don't know, Sally, you just have to stop me if what I sort of, what I include goes a little bit too far. But when we talk about tools in online gambling, then they're for pretty, I would say since the advent of online gambling, there have been sort of pre-commitment tools. Those are, limit setting. So players on, I would say, 99.9% of sites are able to set limits to their own gambling. And in most, I would say in every European jurisdiction, they need to set a limit. So no matter what the limit is, right? The limit could be 10 billion or something like that. But they have to set a limit. And there is research. I mean, there lately a paper. I mean, Paul de Fabro, he published a review paper across all the publications which came out. Then we talked about this before. Voluntary self-exclusion. I mean, I prefer to call it like play breaks, because in a lot of jurisdictions, players are given the option to exclude, very easily for, let's say, for example, 24 hours, just pressing a button, then you are excluded, and you just, you don't need to follow any type of process to sort of and re-enroll, into the gambling site. And then one other thing are like, pop-up messages. So we have done some research, Sally has done some research, Michael Wall, on what effect do messages actually have on players' behavior while they are gambling. What's actually happening. If you tell somebody, look, you have been playing for an hour, would you like to take a break? And does it make, for example, a difference if you tell them, it's very few players actually play for an hour? And that's what we call normative feedback, telling somebody, okay, look, you've spent that amount of money. The average player spends that amount of money, that might make somebody think about it. And there we saw, good effects with this normative type of feedback. And we also found that, one theory in psychology that you might be familiar with is like cognitive dissonance, which means that you show a behavior you're actually not happy about. So let's say you smoke, but somehow, there is a conflict within you. You really enjoy smoking or, I don't know, eating, sugary foods, or, I don't know, procrastinating or watching too much Netflix. I mean, you can apply it to everything, but somehow you don't like, you're not happy with yourself. You have other goals, but, your behavior is not in line with those goals. So in one study that we did, we showed players, like online players, how much they lost. Okay. And then we asked them, is this more than you expected or about as much as you expected? And we assumed that those who said it's more than I expect are the ones who show cognitive dissonance, right? Because they are, sort of surprised by their losses. And there we also found that those players actually reduced their gambling more compared to the ones who said, yeah, that's about as much as I expected. I don't have a problem with that. So you see, I mean, you really have to bring in, sort of somehow, psychological theories to explain their behavior, and then you see that there are benefits.
So you'd say, so is the research indicating then that that those pop-up messages and those interactions actually are effective in helping people moderate their behaviour? Is that the indication?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's been actually some interesting questions which are coming up from people who are watching this, which I think dovetails very nicely into the public health conundrum, which is, of course, balancing people's, individual autonomy. And, as a society, we obviously respect that in all contexts, as you say, whether it's, eating or, whatever it is that we might do, smoking, whatever it is we might do too much of, but nevertheless we consider to be within the realm of stuff we can choose to do. And of course the public interest in protecting people from harms that we actually might have as much control over as we think we do. And one of the questions is whether any of these algorithms are able to or have been directed to identifying platforms that are sort of fundamentally risky, that tend to produce more harmful outcomes. Do we know that, that some types of gaming are just inherently more harmful?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so I mean, you are sort of addressing a very interesting topic here, and that's the whole, discussion about, the sort of game type characteristics, right? So, what types of games sort of create potentially the most type of addictive behavior? Because ultimately, if we sort of, think about it, is that, okay, on the one hand, we have the game, which is, let's call it the drug, and then, you have the person, they consume it, and the question is, are there some, are there some components that are potentially most addictive? And here it all comes down to the question. So given you have a player, and somebody gambling, to what degree, is this person's gambling influenced by the mechanics of a game?
Yeah.
Let's say, I mean, typically we talk about event frequency. How often can you play, right? Naturally, lottery has the lowest event frequency. You can play, of course, an infinite number of games, but there are only 2 draws a week, right? Or 1 draw. Then, you have roulette, you have, slot machines where you can spin the wheel, let's say, every 30 seconds and stuff like that. So, and there's virtually not a single empirical data, like real world data study that ever correlated gambling behavior with the mathematics of games. So everything that people assume as being, relevant components of the drug is actually based on survey data, on asking people, okay, Sascha, what do you think? Is it, is the event frequency important as a, addictive component? Sally, what do you think, etc. So, and I'm now currently, looking into data, trying to figure out if I have a person gambling, okay, and they show, let's say the amount they spend or how often they deposit. To what degree can I explain that behavior with this person's experience, in this session? And to what extent can I actually explain it with the math of the game? Yeah. And my analysis, and I'm just writing up a paper, is only 7% of this person's spend can actually explain with the mathematics of the game, So I believe, because the typical online gambling operator, I mean, all those games are indistinguishable, right? They are all the same, basically, I mean, you have mostly slot machines, I mean, they are different with respect to maybe the topic. Maybe the topic is important, whether it's it's a Egyptian topic, or is it, I don't know, penguins, or I don't know, or is it like a Batman slot machine? You don't know. Those are things nobody ever sort of looked into. But what I found, and that's very surprising, is that only whatever 7% of somebody's behavior can actually be explained by the formerly or currently most sort of acknowledged components of a game.
That's fascinating. So just sort of moving on from that, given that we are able to identify that, because of the data, we can identify risk behaviours. So, I mean, we've got this behavioural data, and we can use that to try to ameliorate harm. What is the potential for this same data to be used to identify low-risk players and for them to be encouraged to take more risks? Like, do we know if the data is sort of being used in the opposite direction as well? And is that something that is currently, within the realm of regulation?
Yeah, you mean like for marketing purposes?
But targeted. So, as you're getting pop-up messages saying, do you realise you've spent more than the average person? Do you realise you've spent less than the average person? And, you could really maybe loosen up a bit, get yourself a drink. Like, does that happen? Is that something that is within the realms of regulation as well in Europe?
I mean, there is so a couple of weeks ago, the Spanish government, they sort of issued, I think it's called a royal decree, because there is like a king there, and they actually started, how shall I put it? So this royal decree says that operators must not advertise to high-risk players. And in my sort of opinion, this is the first regulator who ever put this in law, telling the online gambling operator, whatever way you use to identify high-risk players, So, of course, they don't tell them you have to use that algorithm or anything like that. But whatever you use, you have to prove to us, or you have to sort of keep records who was high risk at which point of time, and you must not advertise to those players, must not, give them any bonuses and things like that.
So that is currently regulated, that you can't, that you've got to that marketing needs to be also tailored.
Yeah, and most operators, I mean, let's say every operator I work with, and the large ones I know who basically take that matter seriously, they all exclude, the ones they believe are high risk from any, targeted marketing, and from sort of any bonuses that they wouldn't give them any. So that's like typical MO that they apply.
So, I mean, it's interesting. Some of the there's things that obviously can be replicated between online gaming and face-to-face real world gambling, so in the gambling context. But I mean, one of the things that you raised earlier was, we don't fully understand the correlation between game type characteristics and what makes some games, more enticing. It doesn't seem to be the maths of the game. It does, as you say, seem to be some more complex psychological phenomenon that we don't have a good handle on yet. Is it easier or harder to work out those things in an online context where we've got a lot of digital data to see what people are doing, but we can't observe people? So we can't necessarily see, their demeanour, how they're interacting with the game. Is there additional data that we can get from observing people in real life that can shed some light on, say, game type characteristics and risky behaviour online? Is there much work sort of bringing those two things together?
Yeah, so there have been some studies that looked into actually, sort of unstructured data, like, email communications with, customer care, telephone calls. So, like how do sort of problematic players, or obviously problematic players, what kind of communication do they show, not face to face, but with, the online gambling operator, and it's, been shown that, they are more aggressive, and to them, matters are much more urgent. So basically, when they have an issue, they want this issue to be, sort of handled, much faster, than, the typical recreational player. So there, even in the online environment, you can basically, if you get hold of those data and you are able to connect the communication, the text message, the email, the chat protocol to the player, and if you're able to connect it with the gambler, you can learn a whole lot about, qualitative criteria that can give you insights into somebody's demeanor, how do they feel at that very moment.
I think that's an opportunity that exists in land-based venues as well, if I can interject. That because in certainly in some jurisdictions, including in Australia, there is a requirement for land-based venues to detect harm and to be monitoring players and to act if someone has obvious symptoms of problem gambling. Now, that regulation is very much focused at the pointy end. So there's a lot of leeway to wait and say, well, I asked them and they said they didn't have a problem, or to really wait until the indicators are very strong, 3+ indicators of very strong gambling problems. So it's not picking up people at lower risk, but feasibly, if there's a monitoring program in place and staff for each shift, and there are required to have staff monitoring the actual gaming floor and for the poker machines, for example, to be in one particular area of a venue so that it is feasible to monitor them. But there could be inputs going in, because especially if they're identified players, if they're members of that venue, staff could be putting in indicators and essentially creating a log, which can be accompanied to player loyalty card data, or if there's a cashless gambling system in place, which is increasingly being discussed. And this could be adding additional reference points. So you could combine the tracking data with an indicator of, for example, low mood or aggression or whatever it is observed. And that could be an additional data point. Plus, you can actually have the venue staff walk up and say, how are you doing? Which is what they're supposed to be doing as well. So you can start to, I think, increase the accuracy. However, the fallback is someone can just take their card out at the moment and play just without being tracked. So it's an incomplete record compared to the complete record of online. But I do think that there's a lot of movement towards that and interest in how that could work.
Yeah. Sally, even in online, the record is not complete because we know that, people play with various operators. Some countries, they try to, like now in Germany, they try to establish a countrywide online sort of, registration database, which means that, let's say, if, you sort of be living in Germany, you register with an operator, that then they report your data into this database, and whenever you try to register with somebody else, they know it's you, basically. And then you would have sort of a more or less complete picture, except somebody goes, and plays offshore, then of course not. But I totally agree. In land-based, you see those indications more clearly in terms of how people behave, and I believe a problem player will show some types of indications that you will be able to spot based on, their whole demeanor. And that can totally go unrecognized in online gambling, especially if somebody splits their behavior across many operators, which they can, of course, do.
Do you mind if I go back to this? I mean, because this is the interesting challenge, it seems to me, in online gambling, because, in some ways you have lots and lots of data, but you're missing that crucial observational data. So when you're talking about the mathematical design of the game, are you including those I don't know what you call them, tools or features, which we know they're designed to be extra enticing, and they are extra enticing, like little boxes with rewards and things like that inside. Do you include that as the mathematical design of the game, or do you include those? Is that the sort of characteristics that you think we need to understand better?
Yeah, no, the mathematical sort of aspects of a game that have been assumed to, of course, which are, of course, to some extent relevant, and they are, of course, all intercorrelated, right? Because ultimately, if somebody designs a game, then they need that game sort of to pay out less than was paid in, otherwise it wouldn't be profitable over, let's say, a few billion 1 billion of theoretical spins. Otherwise the game sort of doesn't work, right? So the casino ultimately always wins, correct? So what you typically have there is the event frequency. So how often does sort of how often do you can you sort of play the game, right? In roulette, it's typically, I don't know, 50-60 seconds. That's simply how long it takes for the wheel to spin, right? In a slot machine, that's typically 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds, because you will have some time in between, etc. Then you have the RTP, like the return to player. So over, let's say, an infinite number of events, what percent of the money that was wagered was actually paid out? And that's typically 90 to 99%, let's say 95%. Other things are the volatility. So how often do you actually on average win? So is it every third game, every 10th game, etc.? And that then, of course, is correlated with how much you win. So you have high volatility games where you win rarely, but when you win larger, right? And then you have low volatility games when you win very often, but you win very little. So, it's all intercorrelated, because ultimately, whatever they do with the game math, ultimately, over an infinite amount of time, it has to pay out less than was put in.
Yeah. So one of the key questions in sort of in regulation, really, or whether your approach to managing risk is going to be a heavy regulatory approach, or whether you are going to be relying more on self-regulation by the gambling companies, is the attitude about the service providers. How have service providers the gambling service providers, how have they responded in Europe to these challenges? I mean, what would you say the attitude of the industry is towards these requirements and the potential to reduce harm in this way?
I think, like those non-algorithmic requirements, let's put it like, simple tools like limit setting, etc. They are part of every, sort of gambling service providers like platform. I'm talking about, a platform that you can use to offer online gambling. So that's something which has been part of their toolkit for a very long time. On the other hand, the algorithmic approach, something that we do, that's very few companies or, researchers have, sort of embraced that area. Also, of course, because the potential market is also very low, right? So you have a few regulations which require it actively from the operator, but still the operator can do it however they want, right? They don't have to sort of follow a certain approach. And in the past, I mean, some operators were extremely forthcoming in the past, let's say 10 years ago, and they presented themselves as, you know, we have this tracking, this identification algorithm, etc. But they never disclosed any procedures, you know, published any papers, nothing. And then some regulators, I think, I mean, that's at least what I think happened, is they realized, okay, you tell me that you spot problem gambling, right, with an algorithm. Then I can't, you know, I mean, we cannot, you know, sort of evaluate what you're doing there. But what we can actually do is we can evaluate how effective it is, you know, because when you spot problem gambling, you most likely get in touch with players. Otherwise, why would you do it? Correct? Yeah. And then now some regulators, they ask operators really to show them, okay, what were the effects, you know, of your interactions, of your automated messages, you know, what happened, you know, did players reduce their gambling? Did they stop to gamble? Did they play more? You have to prove this to us.
And do we know that? Like what?
Yeah. That's.
And so that data was being provided, and we've got a good picture now.
Exactly. So we published a couple of papers too about, you know, what happens if I send, you know, messages to players based on, you know, their behavior. So for example, one good example is where you can really see, I mean, in my opinion, it's very basic, but in my opinion, it's a real good example of harm reduction. So imagine you have a player who, you know, sort of shows indications of problematic play, like they deposit a lot within sessions because once their balance goes down to zero, they can't stop. Their impulsivity gets the better of themselves, you know, and they sort of deposit again and they continue to gamble, right? So you have somebody like that, and very often they never withdraw any money, right? They just deposit, they gamble, they win, they re-gamble their winnings. So they never manage to take anything out. Okay, so now imagine you are able to, you know, track such a player's behavior in a very timely manner. You see that they win something, you know, which is a large win compared to their typical balance that they have. Then in that very moment, you try to nudge this player to withdraw some of that money from their account, you know, and we see, and we publish those studies that, you know, is successful in, you know, significantly sort of in a significant number of cases, because first of all, they were in a positive mood, right? They haven't lost, they're not pissed, you know, that they just lost again in the session. No, they just won. And you sort of try to nudge them, you know, take some of that money, buy yourself, you know, a nice dinner. The money can be gone faster, you know, than you think. And then they do it, you know, and you break sort of this cycle or vicious cycle of always depositing, winning, gambling it all away. And it's a positive experience for the player.
So would you say that the industry has been generally forthcoming and on board with this? I mean, what do you think the general attitude of the industry, at least in Europe, has been to, I mean, embracing the challenge of risk management?
Well, I think it always has to, I mean, there are, of course, competing, to some degree, there are competing interests, right? So, you know, in the first place, they want to generate revenue. And on the other hand, I mean, you have gambling being, you know, a very special, you know, type of activity with a lot of sort of, you know, focus on it with respect to, you know, the potential harm it can cause. And regulators more and more introduced those types of measures, and the industry followed, right? But as a consequence, of course, of the regulatory requirements. So very few operators basically came forward before and said, yeah, you know, we're going to do this. We're going to have the risk scoring. We're going to interact with the players, etc. And that's, I believe, where you see, for example, now North American market, right? I mean, you don't have any requirements for player monitoring. You don't have any requirements for player interactions, for let's say mandatory play breaks or anything like that. So, and I believe it's justified, right? Why should they sort of go ahead and introduce things that ultimately could potentially hurt them, because nobody knew back then. But ultimately they learned that it's actually something they can also use to their benefit. And now you see a lot of online gambling operators who very proudly sort of present their social responsibility approach as a way of marketing themselves. And that's, I believe, Sascha, what you also see in other industries, correct?
Yeah, I mean, in the end, these executives, I mean, they still have a social life. They've still got to be able to, hold their head up at a dinner party and say, I work for the gambling industry, and not be shunned. So, there is a sort of, there are social reasons that, in terms of the general reputation of the companies not to be sort of, too obviously evil. So whilst it very clearly, there very clearly is, an essential motivation to make the most money out of people, as possible, as there is in any industry, there will be a degree of wanting to be seen to be responsible. But it's partly cultural, and it depends on a number of factors. So I was just sort of interested to know whether social responsibility is something that is, really, embraced by in the marketing of these companies, if they sort of tend to make a big deal about the fact that, look, we're a really responsible company, we do this and we do that, or if it's just reluctance all the way, and it's just kind of, sticking with the minimum requirements, because they're the sorts of things that need to be balanced.
I mean, there's one more sort of, I mean, people like me who try to convince them to go, sort of to embrace those approaches, or Sally or others. I mean, we always would say, look, I mean, a sort of recreational player who can afford, their way they play will be more loyal over the long run compared to somebody who, sort of is out of control and will spend everything in a very short period of time. And I was really interested whether this is actually true. And we did one study where we actually, I mean, which supports that hypothesis. The players who play within the limits, who choose to limit themselves, who activate those types of voluntary limits, they have a longer sort of customer lifetime with the operator compared to those who do not use any of those responsible gambling controls. Nobody knows whether this is something which somebody, intrinsically chooses, and you can't make them do it, right? Because it's part of their sort of, personality setting. But we could really show that those players actually are more loyal, play longer with an operator compared to those who don't have any of those sort of limit settings activated.
So did you say that we can show that, or where?
Yeah, we did show that. We have published it.
Well, it's very lucky that you can sort of demonstrate that harm reduction strategies actually are a win-win in the long term. There's another question that's come up, which is about whether when the responsibility of the service provider is seen to end under the European regulation. So, for example, there's obligations to interact with players that are sort of exhibiting risky behaviour. Is there any obligation once that interaction is initiated, if the player just sort of keeps on going? Is the obligation simply to make the initial contact, and if nothing happens, well, you've done your part, that's it? Or are there further obligations to actually move to restrict activity if prompting people to? Yeah.
So that's exactly what they are obliged to do. So, because of course you have players who won't, react towards notifications, they don't sort of lower their limits, you might not get hold of them, etc., etc. And in most sort of jurisdictions, then the operator has to get in touch with the player. If the player does not, provide any information, they have to block them. So basically, the player, is banned from gambling. And if the player sort of gets in touch, then they have to prove that they can sort of afford that type of gambling, and they, hard to prove that they are not a problematic player, but they have to sort of, send in, let's say, a source of wealth information, be it, a pay slip, be it a utility bill, all that kind of stuff, so that the operator ultimately sort of makes the decision, okay, we can let this person carry on gambling.
I think we've covered such a broad range, and I apologize if we haven't gotten to all of the questions that people have put into the YouTube chat. Please do keep them coming, and if anyone's online wants to jump in, feel free to add lots of responses. We will add some of the links to Michael's papers to the show notes, because there's a wealth of information out there, and that I think many people will be interested to follow up on. As we're sort of coming towards the end of this, it's a broad topic, and I think we've just, Sascha, particularly through your questions, we've opened up more lines of questioning, and there's many more out there as well. But I want to give you both the opportunity to sort of add your, maybe, I don't know if you can put an overarching thought in, or unanswered questions or areas for future research that you're keen. Maybe Michael, you can start of giving us an overview of what you're up to at the moment. What are the next steps for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So as I said before, so I'm very interested at the moment in, the sort of game as such and the interaction with the gambler, because there's very little research out there, and regulators are increasingly asking operators to sort of rate their product profile in terms of risk. So that's something I'm very interested in. And then, of course, the ultimate question, getting hold of like a set of players who answer like a gambling screen correlated with the data, and try to figure out, of course, improve, the markers of harm. That's basically what, we are up to currently. And of course, we have a lot of data in terms of the real-time interactions that our system does with players, and getting a better idea what types of pop-up messages really work, and can you sort of predict who reacts beneficially, not only in terms of one message, but in sort of a series of messages. So that's what I'm mostly interested in at the moment.
And Sascha, where are your thoughts? Obviously, AI isn't looking at the data yourself isn't your area, but where are your kind of thoughts around the legal and ethical aspects of this technology as it evolves across industries?
My thoughts are actually that in Australia, we're in a very nascent phase in terms of regulation. So, I mean, our regulatory requirements are not as sophisticated as the European requirements. And so we don't have as much available data. So I think actually there's a lot to learn from looking at that jurisdiction to work out how we can best manage this industry, which is really only it's still in a growth phase. The technology is still developing. So, I think we can have a lot to learn from the sort of work that Michael's doing. I'm really looking forward to reading his papers. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you. Great talking to you too.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much that's going on, and Sascha, you've definitely described it well, that in Australia, at least, we're very much in a growth and a learning phase. From my perspective, I've been looking at behavioural data sets across wagering companies. So we did a study with 6 different operators all combined. So we're trying to overcome the limitation of just looking at one operator at a time, because we know that obviously customers are different, but we weren't able to track the customers across their journey with different operators. So it was still de-identified data. We don't think that there were like customers that were overlapping, but we weren't sort of tracking a player's journey across their entire gambling. That's obviously one big issue that I don't know that anyone's really dealt with unless there's some kind of national card or identification system linking operators. But one thing we're looking at also is that voluntary uptake. So when you send someone a message, how do you word that message? You've spoken about nudges, Michael, and that idea of, you know, sending it when someone's in a good mood, making it timely, that real-time notification of when does someone need to act, send them the message, an appropriately worded message that fits their own individual psyche. That's obviously a really difficult thing to do because different people are going to respond to different types of priorities. So working out, you know, who are you as a customer and what is the appropriate nudge for you in the right point of time? What's your critical decision point? So really playing around and doing a lot of experimentation with what's the right timely message, because a message in and of itself can be so powerful if it's received at the right time, in the right state of mind. It's a really cost-effective, simple thing to do, but it's quite difficult to work out what those are. So how do we, or even if it's the positioning. So we did some studies that showed when you make a tool opt out rather than opt in, obviously the use skyrockets. So you know, how you design the tools, how you market them, what do you call them, you know, moving away from things like gambling harms and problem gambling and prevention, talking more about play management and customer, you know, customer management and some of the game sense sort of branding that we've seen in some North American casinos. So what you even call the tools, all of that stuff really impacts how someone is to use it. And the other thing we're looking at is, obviously we touched on land-based industry, but what other industries? So financial industries is something we've talked about a few times on this webinar series of, can banks and credit card companies start detecting risk? Because that potentially is the way of tracking someone's gambling across different, you know, not only gambling sites, but also in venues, looking at ATM withdrawals and things like an FPOS transaction. So financial institutions, which do see that whole much broader picture of income relative to expenses and gambling across operators, that's a hugely powerful way to potentially identify risk and intervene. And we have seen a number of banks allow credit cards to be blocked, but it is obviously more difficult to legally stop someone spending their own money from a debit account. So there's a whole range of ethical issues there as well. But I think we've got so much to learn, and I'm certainly going to be sharing this conversation with people from different industries. But I want to really thank both of you for those really useful insights that you have provided. I think it's been a really powerful conversation, and that we're really at the beginning stages. So you know, hopefully there's lots of people tackling this from different avenues.
Thanks.
So thank you both. Thank you, Michael, for staying up so late to be with us live. Really appreciate that. And you did fantastically for the end of the day. Obviously, this is an area that's very close to your interests. So thank you so much. And thank you, Sascha, for bringing your relevant thoughts and inquisitive mind. It's always, you've been on the webinar several times now, and it's obviously clear from how well it always goes that you're a huge fan favorite. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And thank you for everyone that tuned in live. And if you're watching after the fact, please do share this with anyone you think might be interested. I think the implications of our conversation are quite broad reaching. So with that, I will hand over to Khalil to introduce our topic for next week.
Thank you very much, Sally. And just to put a pin in one other thing, I think what we'll try to do is get a few papers from Michael to put into the show notes so that if people want to come back and actually read some of the papers that we've been talking about in the session, that they'll be able to find them there. So yes, so thank you very much, Michael and Sascha. That was a great session. It seems like there's like this overall trend where a lot of the technical problems are being solved by people like Michael, and then a lot of like the biggest problems that were starting to emerge in the field of gambling studies are ethical problems, and ones where having people like Sascha around thinking about them on a deep level is incredibly helpful, because it's certainly one where you know, I don't think as a field we've spent enough time thinking about these, and certainly as jurisdictions and regulators and all sorts of stakeholders, we haven't contemplated what this technology really means on a deep level. So thank you both very much for that conversation. Next week, we have another really interesting conversation that's going to be talking about a new technology that's emerging and is sort of overlapping with gambling in a very unique way that I don't fully understand. And so we've brought in two experts to talk about it. So this session, Sascha actually became the most appeared person on the seminar series. And next week, Brett is actually coming back to tie Sascha again. So Brett Barbanel will be one of the speakers next week, along with Mark Johnson, and they're going to be talking about gamification that occurs during video game live streaming events, like say on Twitch. And so they recently published a paper in that area. So they're going to come and talk about that and all of the surrounding issues that emerge from it. So another really interesting thing at the nexus of technology and gambling and risk-taking. So for Sally and for the Brain and Mind Center, we'll say thank you very much for attending it. And thank you again to Tom for all your help behind the scenes. And we hope to see you all again next week.